Ladies and gentlemen, this freaking novel right here, where do I begin to describe such a phantasmagoric, sprawling, absurd, labyrinthine novel like Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu? I finished this book this morning and I thought I need to make this review now while the thoughts, the questions, the emotions, the confusion are still alive and vivacious in my mind rather than let the days start to fade and discombobulate my thoughts on the book. So I have a super long note on my phone with notes. I have my Notion filled with notes. I have my long review I wrote up this morning that's on Goodreads and on my Substack. So if you want a more condensed version of my thoughts on the book, you can check that out and I'll link it below. But today we're going to be discussing this novel, Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu. This is a book that I've seen touted and acclaimed on YouTube as just a masterpiece. I've seen some readers who are way more versed in literature, who have way more depth to pull from, that have claimed this book is the best book they've ever read, or at least the best book they've read in a very long time and in recent years. And so I went in with a lot of expectations, and I have to say, it exceeded all of them. And although I do not have a long list of books and extensive library and history to pull from where I can say, without a doubt, this is a must read, this is the best book ever, anything like that. But what I can say is it's likely the best book or one of the best books I've ever read. And I think it will be hard to knock it off that pedestal for a while. And here's how I want to structure this review, this discussion about this book, because it is such a labyrinthine plot. It has so many different spiraling directions that it goes down. It has so many diverging points and plots and characters and ideas that I'm going to keep it kind of structured, but not too structured, because so many of the themes and the ideas are going to overlap. And that's actually, I think, the beauty of this book is, as I was reading it, I noticed the crumbs that were being left. I noticed the certain characters or moments or artifacts or scenes that were starting to illuminate the path of where this book is headed. I started to understand where this narrator is going. I understood more of his persona, the bones of this book. And yet at the same time, the way that it all connected, the way that these winding roads that seemingly have no or a very loose relevance to the kind of intersection that they eventually meet at, I was just amazed to see how they came together so in a so uniform and masterful way. I mean, I think Cartarescu is such a orchestrator and virtuoso in this novel that I was stunned, honestly, because with 100 pages to go, I was like, this is likely a 5-star. I love it. But the way it ended was just so magnificent, and so comforting is not the right word. It just felt right. The way it ended felt right. It felt complete. I felt satisfied and content with the way it ended. But let's get to the book. I'm already rambling too much. That's the preamble to this magnificent, perplexing novel that is full of riveting scenes, historical facts about Romania and specific enigmatic individuals, and Charles Boole, and philosophical concepts, and Kafka, and everything intertwined into one just profound and astounding and metaphysical story and investigation about how do we escape this torment, this fearful, this painful existence. How do we avoid falling into the void of eternal damnation? Well, that's what we're gonna discover and discuss today. So let's begin with a little bit of an introduction about the author and about the translator, most importantly, that we can read this through in English. The author is Mircea Cartarescu. It's going to be the best I can pronounce it, and he is a Romanian author who grew up in communist Romania, which was a very turbulent time, and you see the barren society, the geometrical, dilapidated state of the country in this novel. The way he describes Bucharest and the different towns and the people and the culture. You really see that carried through in this novel, as well as the kind of medical malpractice that went on at the time, and the fear and the distrust of medicine and science that was a consequence of such malpractice, where they would vaccinate an entire school with the same needle, where they would rip out teeth or perform surgeries with very little anesthesia or something to help alleviate any pain, assuage the discomfort of the procedure. And we see some of those elements that he grew up with in his own life put into the life of the narrator, who we never get the name of, which we'll get to in a minute. But again, continuing with Cartarescu, Solenoid was actually written in the 2010s area, and it was published, I believe, in its native tongue, Romanian. In 2015, it was only translated and published here in America in English in 2022 by Sean Cotter. And Sean Cotter has actually translated another one of Cartarescu's books before, Blinding, published by Archipelago Books, and that was published back in 2013. So this is his second English work, well, actually third. There is a Penguin edition of one of his books, Nostalgia, as well, that I plan to pick up. But Blinding is another really popular work. It's part of a trilogy called Orbitor that Cartarescu has released in Romanian, and that was Blinding just part one. So basically, he's a relatively unknown author, and I think people started to catch the buzz with him when Blinding was published, but because it was published by a small independent nonprofit publisher, it didn't get national recognition, and even right now, I can't buy it. I'm trying to find a copy. If you have a copy or you know how to get me a copy, let me know. But it's just not available in print right now. It's on back order. And so Solenoid has been the kind of opportunity to get your feet dug into this magnificent author. And he drew me in because I had heard about this book as it being a stream of consciousness and very self-conscious work, and existential, philosophical, and just mysterious in that way. And so I figured this would be my kind of book, my style, and it definitely was. The first subsection of this book I want to get into is this main theme of eternal damnation. And what it is, and you see it in the narrator's angst and anxiety that he thinks about with death, but you also see it with the Picketists, which are these, it's basically this group that is protesting and picketing against death, disease, sickness, suffering, pain, all these things. And what it is this anxious frustration, dread, whatever word you want to put on it, that we all feel when we recognize that we are here. He says, quote, that we are children of the cosmos living for a nanosecond on a speck of dust in the infinite depths of the night. And the reoccurring thought and feeling throughout this novel that the characters experience and the Picketists have is this feeling of dread, because we are thrown onto this earth without understanding our origins, without knowing purpose, meaning, and we're given this consciousness to question our meaning, question our purpose, to be cognizant of the pain and the suffering, the agony, the dread that we go through, and yet have no answer for it, have no escape. Know that death, disease are waiting for us inevitably on the other side of life, and that there's nothing we can do about it. The narrator describes us as lambs headed to the slaughter, one after another, billions of mankind, billions of humans just being led to the slaughter and never being able to escape this fate that we were given, never being able to transcend into the eternal or even understand what we're supposed to do. And so that's what a lot of what's going on in this novel is how do we find this escape plan? How do we escape, the exit? And there's a lot of, again, diverging points that lead to this same idea of escaping. And one of them being, early in the novel, we're introduced to these two stories that the character read in his adolescence. One was this prisoner who is in a cell surrounded by like an infinitely thick wall. And in the story, he starts to hear these taps, and he hears these taps and he thinks that they're just, random. He starts to take them, though, as a sign. He starts to take it as maybe these taps that I'm hearing are some kind of sign or message, something from the great beyond, some God or some higher power, something transcendent is trying to speak to me. And he actually figures out a plan through the taps to escape his cell. And he returns to find out, hey, I want to thank the guy that was tapping on the other side of the cell, telling me how to get out. And there was no one there. There was no one on the other side. There were no taps, basically. And there's another story as well where this man wakes up. His wife has gone outside sometime in the snow, and he sees her footprints, and then the footprints suddenly stop. So she has just disappeared. The last thing that she left left there was her footprints in the snow. And eventually they kill the man because they think he's crazy and he must have killed his wife and this and that. But basically what these two stories are showing, and what connects to the next point, is this idea of some kind of fourth dimension, some kind of mystical component that we are able to communicate with. Something that we're able to receive a sign, a message, that if we just listen clearly enough, if we just stay open-minded and wait for some sign, we can potentially escape this reality that we're stuck in. That maybe there's something beyond the tangible, material, natural world and reality that we conceive of it. That there is something else out there, basically. And even if you're not entertaining this at all in a reality or in a realistic sense, it's a very fascinating idea, and he connects it to George Boole, who is a mathematician who has two daughters, Mary Ellen and Ethel. Ethel ends up writing this book, The Gadfly, which is the book that the narrator is just crying over as a youth when he's reading. So there's this lineage connection going on. Mary Ellen actually invented some mathematical principles as well, was a mathematician herself. And she ended up marrying Charles Hinton, who created this idea of the fourth dimension. He figured out or conceived of this idea of the tesseract and this fourth dimension. And so what Cartarescu is doing in this book is he's taking some kind of abstract, mystical, occult type idea of something transcendent, and he's attaching to it some kind of historical relevance, mathematical theorems and ideas on how this could potentially be true. How could this even be possible? Because he conceives that if there is a fourth dimension, if you think of a 2D figure, a flat square, it will never conceive of depth. You could hold something, if I was a 2D figure, you could hold something to the side of me or whatever it is, and I would never see it because it's in a third dimension that I don't exist within. So if that's true, and there is a fourth dimension, a fifth, a sixth, something like that, and we're three-dimensional creatures, we could never conceive of that. So in theory, a fourth dimensional organism or something like that could break into a safe without going through a third dimension. It could reorganize or heal your organs without having to break into those three dimensions that we're familiar with. It can kind of go beyond and transcend in some way. And that's what he alludes to or explicitly states is, a figure like Christ could be actually healing people because Christ has access to this fourth dimension. This prisoner who's hearing taps, it's because he's hearing taps from this fourth dimension that he cannot, perceive outside of that. So there's this very interesting, very fascinating idea going on. And I like how he describes it. If I flip back to the section here on 352, talking about George Hinton, he says, quote, breaking through the prison of these three dimensions through the use of mathematical reasoning equals, in fact, ecstasy, divine infection, the blinding state of Satori. And above that, he said, Hinton used his mind in the same way to understand the unintelligible, to record like the poet whose eyes he had the inexpressible. See, how the character, the narrator, conceives of literature is also very fascinating. There's this conception that the Magic Mountain and War and Peace and 100 Years of Solitude, I hope I'm pronouncing or stating that book right. He references a couple books here that are instant classics that come to mind. Maybe you read them, maybe you haven't. And he says all these are great. All these are great masterpieces, but they're not the epitome. They're not the greatest heights that literature can reach. They're escapism. And not in the way that he's trying to escape, but they're this distraction. They kind of distract you from this abysmal fate that we face when people like Kafka, writers that speak to the inexpressible sorrow or grief or pain of mankind. That's what he says, something along the lines of God is going to take those writers, he's going to take those books and put them together as a collection and title it The Book of Human Suffering. And it speaks to some truth. And how I conceptualize it is that great literature, great art expresses what can only be understood and not explained. Great art, great literature has some kind of capacity that extends and transcends beyond language. The way I like to think of it is think about the experience of losing a loved one, losing a child. There's no words you can attach to that pain, that suffering, that agony, that misery. There's no words that are going to describe that. Yet if you've experienced something like it, you understand. But you can't express it beyond understanding. That's why poems speak to us. That's why books like these speak to us. Music can move us to tears because it's not simply the noise we're hearing. It's not simply the words, but even if it's not, it almost feels like something supernatural comes about and speaks to us, but speaks without words, if you know what I mean. So literature and art has this way of expressing the inexpressible. And that's what he's getting at here. But to tie it back to the escaping, the exit plan, the stories I just referenced about the snow and the prisoner and all of that, on 353, he says, quote, people set within a flat world cannot imagine a third dimension. A prisoner inside a cell made of 4 lines will remain there forever, never noticing that he could escape by moving perpendicular to the plane by taking flight, pure and simple, up through the non-existent wall facing the third dimension. A little bit further down, nothing would be easier than to help a prisoner escape if you have, in comparison to him, an extra dimension. You simply take him between your fingers and lift him up, perpendicular to his world, into a space he cannot imagine. Those around him will only see him miraculously disappear. His footsteps in the snow will stop suddenly in the middle of the front yard. So to tie this all together, there's this hope that we can maybe escape this world. Maybe it's not eternal life, but there's this idea that there's this fourth dimension. There's something else out there that we can leverage to escape this miserable reality that we're stuck in. If not save ourselves in some way, at least understand, at least start to comprehend, because it seems to us, it seems to the narrator, that we're gifted this consciousness, this mind to understand, and yet we're given no message, no sign to actually understand. We're just kind of stuck here again like lambs to the slaughter. And again, to tie this back to the point about misery and agony and this reality that we want to escape, this, between the Picketists and rebelling against death, is on page 558. We get some of these questions that these Picketists, these people who are infuriated with death and protesting against it, are questioning themselves. How much longer are we going to lie down like cows in the slaughterhouse? Good people, how much longer are we going to eat the bitter bread of our lives? Why are we on earth? To be torn up and buried alive and drowned like cats and sacrificed like sheep. And this is on 558. And this leads to this large group of people essentially being led by the narrator, who, again, I say narrator because we never learn his name. And he's become this almost prophetic figure. This one gentleman, Virgil, got stomped out, which we'll get to the absurdist elements in a moment. But he gets killed, and basically the narrator by the end of the story becomes this kind of prophetic figure. He's kind of here to be their light at the end of the tunnel. He's here to kind of save the people, be a little bit of this Christ-like figure, which we'll get into in a moment. Quote, the hopeless father of the children of the void, the children of waste and sacrifice. So again, he's kind of here, and this is after he had been in the hospital. And these Picketists, to summarize all of this, it comes down to one word, which is literally repeated throughout. I don't know if you can kind of see that. It's repeated page after page for like 7 pages. Just help. It's just one word summarizes it. And what it is this desperate feeling of help, this desperation, because again, we are condemned to eternal suffering. We're condemned to the eternal void, to death, disease. There is no escape. We are just, but yet there's this optimism. I guess I wouldn't call it optimism, but there's this grain of hope that allows all the Picketists together to scream help for 7 pages long. Quote, one word began to sound more often, more dominant, more burning, the word that embodied hopelessness, the word of hell, of black eternal flames and regret and self-hatred. Help. So again, all this going on, this connection between eternal damnation, pain, suffering, agony, torment, dread, everything that we have in this existence, very similar to what the existentialists are noticing once you are absent of a god or some kind of higher belief or power. Nihilism essentially is what's coming upon people, this dread and fear of eternal death. And there's this hopelessness, yet there's just enough to scream help, to look for an escape plan. And what the narrator's doing, and where he's leveraging these different pieces of whether it's art or fourth dimension, these different stories, or the solenoids, which we'll get to in a minute, he's pulling all these different kind of divergent points together to seek out an escape plan, to listen for the signs, listen for the messages, have this sense of faith and belief that he is the chosen one, that there is some escape plan, there is something that they can do. And to round this off on page 546, quote, art has no meaning if it's not an escape. If it's not born of a prisoner's despair, I can't respect any art that comforts and relieves those novels and music and paintings designed to make your prison more bearable. A little bit further on, we are all prisoners inside multiple concentric prisons. I am the prisoner of my mind, which is the prisoner of my body, which is the prisoner of my world. So again, just to hammer this point over one more time, great art, real art for the narrator, for Cartarescu, is art that speaks an inexpressible truth, that expresses the inexpressible, that communicates through a medium beyond the tangible, beyond language. Music and regular poetry and regular art and books and things like that, they are just making your prison cell more bearable. They are not seeking an escape plan. They are not seeking an exit. That's the difference. All right, now let's talk about some of the absurdity that goes on in this book, because it's really quite fun. And what I think is beautiful about how it's artistically done is that Cartarescu doesn't add in these absurdist elements, these Kafkaesque scenes, as this, for this purpose of wow factor, for oh my gosh, look what happened, or wow, how magical and fun and elaborative this is. No, I mean, there is some of that to it. There are certain scenes where like, that's pretty cool, or that's crazy, or wow, I didn't expect that. But he does it in a way that he connects the irrational with the rational. He merges in these absurd situations and events and phenomena with reality and possibilities in a way that convince the reader, you, that the line between reality and possibility is a bit more blurry than you think. The line between what is real and tangible and natural and what is phenomenal and impossible and mystical, there's a bit more crossover than you think. At least in this novel, he does it in a way that you don't pause for a minute and remember, oh yeah, I'm reading a fiction. I'm reading a made-up story. You really feel this state of, you override disbelief is what happens. You read about these monsters under this apartment cell. You read about him being sucked under at this school at, I think it's pronounced Voila, at the school he's at, where there's like, they're doing these wild procedures to the children. You have these solenoids that are making you levitate, and the character is constantly levitating either by himself or having sex with his girlfriend Irina. And you see all these absurd components. His house is this ridiculously, almost seemingly endless rooms are within it, and it's just like this strange magical built house. You see all these absurd components, and you don't get stuck on the irrational believability of it. you fully accept it and kind of just keep going, and they actually add to the plot. That's the thing too. They actually add to the plot. And one of the biggest absurdist components, and well, before I get to that, I'll say you see Kafka's influence just riddled throughout this book. The influence of Kafka is immense, and the author doesn't hide it. He literally quotes Kafka multiple times in the book. There's a specific quote that gets repeated. He speaks about him all the time in his interviews, and so Kafka's influence is just irreplaceable. And especially when you think about Kafka's writing, how he had this level of absurdity, uncertainty, anxiety, this loneliness. All of that is right here. It's almost I wouldn't call it a continuation of Kafka's work, but it's almost like if you took some of the best components of it and then let someone else be a little bit of the mouthpiece of it. He carries on a bit of that tradition, I think, beautifully, is what I would say. But one of the biggest components of these absurd themes is these nightmares and this idea of dreaming. Now, if you think about dreaming, you can tie it back to Descartes, is this uncertainty between reality and the dream world. Okay, you have this dream world which seemingly follows its own set of rules. You have components that are real people or that are possible things mixed with the impossible, and then you also have reality, and you get this crossover going on, which how can you tell between reality and the dream world possibility? And it kind of ties into the fourth dimension stuff, but you also have the absurd situation where he goes over and recounts dream after dream after dream, where there are these demonic figures or these nightmares that occur within the book, that he states, I woke up and they were there. I woke up and they were looking at me on my bed, and then they descended into the shadows. So there's this, again, questioning whether is this main character just a schizophrenic? Is what you start to wonder. You're like, what is going on here? Because he like explicitly states, like, this is a dream, but this part occurred after I woke up. Or these different components happen, and these different situations happen where there's not a clear, definitive distinction. There's no distinction between this nightmare being complete fabrication and being reality. And I think that makes it, again, really fun. It ties to the fourth dimension stuff. It ties to this demonic suffering that we're inevitably headed towards. All of this blends so well. It becomes this hodgepodge of overlapping themes that I think is just beautiful. And how I view the novel is it's very much like origami, because it's folding and unfolding all over itself throughout the whole work. So many overlapping components that are building and forming and manifesting to this apotheosis, this culminating point that just ties everything together in a way that you didn't fully see coming. Before I get to that ending that we'll get to, and we'll wrap up a few other points that maybe I'm forgetting, is I have to wonder if Cartarescu has read Fernando Pessoa before. And if not, there's still a lot of interesting similarities you can draw between Pessoa's conception of being a dreamer and the dream world and fate and all of that, and this disquiet and anxiety, and how Cartarescu's main character is perceiving of it. Especially when you think about Pessoa, again, draws a very blurry line between what is real and what is not. And even if there is a reality in a dream world that's not real, he kind of says, what's the difference? I've dreamed and lived a million lives that I've never have. He can dream up of any possibility, and that's freeing to Pessoa in a way. I really like this quote. I've repeated it before on the channel. Again, from the Penguin edition on it's like the 400th entry. Quote, an expensive cigar smoked with one's eyes closed. That's all it takes to be rich. And if you think about that, if you just close your eyes, you have a cigar with you, you have the sensation of the cigar, you maybe put on a little bit of ASMR beach noise, you can just imagine yourself anywhere. And that's the beauty of the imagination. That's the beauty of a possibility. It's not reality, but in a way, for the subjective, what's the difference? Like there's sensibility going on, and or not going on for that matter, but there's something there. There's something there. There's something worth exploring, and that's what I love is how many questions, how many moments of wonder does this book provoke. You don't have to believe in a fourth dimension. You don't got to believe in anything occult. You don't have to believe in all of this stuff. You don't have to believe in a god and an escape plan. But you do have to entertain some of these questions and think about them and think about their possibility. And again, it just ties great in with the novel. Two other quick points I want to mention before we get to some others, because I want to include everything in this review, but again, it's going to be sporadic. I'm probably going to forget a few things that I am angry at myself for later, but I want to make this review without making it too structured and without referencing other people's reviews. I want to go in very blind and just pour my heart out here. So two quick points is one, he has early in the novel this poem, The Fall. So when he was a child, he was supposedly born with a conjoined twin or some kind of twin brother. I kind of have the theory that there never was a twin brother who died or disappeared. I think the idea there being that there's this alternative reality, this alternate version of the narrator that went on to live another life. Because throughout the novel, he talks about this other, the other, his twin self, who, this reflection of him kind of in the mirror, that went on to be a famous writer and did all these different things and was successful, but didn't seek out the same escape plan that he did. Ties back to that idea of real literature versus not, and speaking, to make the cell comfortable or not comfortable, or seeking to get an escape plan. So I imagine that this discussion over and over throughout the novel of some kind of twin brother that he wishes he still had or something like that, I think is this feeling of what could have been, a what if. Because early in the novel, I really love this section when he's talking about The Fall, is this poem he wrote. And it was this really traumatic experience because he got just humiliated in a way that seemingly set him back. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Here it is. Literally the fifth section in this chapter, page 32. Quote, "The fall, the first and only map of my mind, fell the evening of October 24th, 1977. A little bit further on, I have never recovered from the trauma." And he speaks to it in a beautiful way, because I think we've all had this experience of what if. What if I never broke up with so-and-so? What if I moved out of my hometown? What if, I got that job promotion? What if I got accepted to this university? What if so-and-so didn't pass away? All these what ifs that could have spiraled you into a completely different alternative universe. And he talks about this a couple times throughout the novel. He describes them as like these switches in life, that once this switch goes either left or right, you kind of go and diverge into a different self. And then that other self exists, but in a totally different alternative dimension or universe. But I'm going to read this longer quote here just because I think it's beautiful. It's this idea, again, of possibility of alternative realities that blends and overlaps into multiple components in this book. Quote, "It was a catastrophe, but not in the sense of a building collapsing or a car accident, in the sense of a coin flipped toward the ceiling and falling on the wrong side. Of one straw shorter than the others that decides your fate on the raft of the Medusa. With every move we make in our lives, we make a choice, or we are blown by a breath of wind down one aisle or another. The line of our life only solidifies behind us. It becomes coherent as it fossilizes into the simplicity of destiny, while the lives that could have been, that could have diverged, moment by moment, from the life that triumphed are dotted, ghostly lines, creodes, quantum differences, translucid and fascinating like stems vegetating in the greenhouse." What could have been? All right, before we get to the last scene, the culminating point, which I guess I've already spoiled enough by now, but if you're wanting to read the book and you don't want to hear a spoiler, definitely skip the ending here. But the last thing we have to talk about is the solenoids. That's what the book's called, right? The solenoids. Well, what are the solenoids? They're these, wired currents, these electrical currents, I believe, that are situated kind of throughout the city. There's like 5 or 6 of them from my memory. And really their only purpose that they get mentioned or brought up for the most part is this levitating ability. So like I mentioned earlier, the main character notices at some point while he's having this affair with this fellow teacher at the school, Arena, is that he can levitate with this button. It's the solenoid built at the bottom of his house. And so that's what the solenoids are mostly doing throughout the story. There's two main points where they really make a difference. One is in the last scene, and then one right here later in the novel where he meets Mr. Palamar, whichever it is, who was this, he thought he was a librarian, but he's just this older man, now he's older, who, when the narrator was an adolescent, he would check out books from. So that's why he thought he was like a librarian. And he returns to the Gadfly later in life, the narrator does, who I mentioned that the Gadfly was this, gut-wrenching book for him that for some reason just made him cry like crazy. It was written by one of the daughters of George Boole, all these coincidences, which he describes as not being coincidences. That's another thing I could ramble on, but I'll just say that he doesn't believe in coincidences. He thinks everything is kind of deterministic and that you just need to listen out for the signs in a way. So anyway, but he meets Mr. Palamar again because he finds his phone number hidden in like a Gadfly book at the library. He calls him, meets him. There's also this Voynich, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Voynich manuscript, which if you look it up, is quite fascinating. That's the cool thing too about all these different people, whether it's this other guy I'm not going to get into, but Nikolai Vascides, something like that, this Romanian scientist who was doing experiments of like controlled hanging himself to try and experiment about death and dreams, is all these people are real. They're real, and like what is referenced in the book is real. It's just the way that it blends in with the fiction, the real with the fiction. Again, real with fiction, possibility with impossibility. It's all these lines get blurred and just draw you in a way that you relieve any preconceived notion. You relieve any and resign yourself from having any kind of prejudices or beliefs here. You just get sucked in. But I'm going on a tangent again. Back to Mr. Palamar. he has this manuscript he gets from him. He's talking to him, and eventually Palamar tells him, "I'm not a librarian, and for decades now I've been researching and studying mites. Basically, those tiny little dust mites that you might have seen at some point in your life that exist all on our body, all in through the world, that are these tiny microscopic insects or mites that look demonic, look monstrous, look gross, and they're eating dust and all kinds of tiny microscopic particles." And so he says, I've been studying these. And he shows him on his hand, he's got like this white line, which happens to be scabies. It's like basically these parasitic mites that are on his hand, and they've created like this colony on his hand. And he explains to the narrator, they are created, quote, "in a way they're made in my image." They're like his creation is what he's saying. And this is certainly an allusion to, in the Bible, us being told that we are created in the image of God. Man was created in the image of God. So he describes these mites and compares them to mankind. They're created similar in the same image as their creator, which in this case is Mr. Palamar. They have no understanding of their origin. They have no understanding of their meaning, why they're there, where they're at. They have no understanding of the bigger dimension and the gigantism that's going on here, that they're on a creature who's on another planet and so forth. They're just unknown creatures. They're just aimless, and they're suffering, and they're headed towards death and fate, just like mankind. And so what Mr. Palamar tries to do, oddly enough, and again, I think this is just a very like allegorical or metaphorical scene that's going on here, is he uses the solenoid to transform the narrator's consciousness into a mite so that he can go down as some kind of prophet, as some kind of Christ-like figure. Like God sending his son down to the earth, he's going to send the narrator down to these mites to try and tell them the truth. Tell them where they come from. Tell them that their creator loves them, that he wants the best for them, how to escape this. And so he tries to do that, and yet he comes back. It happens all within like a couple hours. And the narrator comes back and tells Mr. Palamar it did not work. They were unable to listen, or they couldn't listen. It just didn't work. And in fact, this scene about the mites being kind of this relation or metaphor to God and humans and Palamar and the mites actually gets kind of set up way back on page 112, where he says, quote, "We think we have access to the logical mathematical structure of the world, but we continue to live without self-consciousness and without understanding, digging tunnels through the skin of God, causing him nothing but fits and irritation. The mites that burrow through my skin do not know me and cannot understand me. And the story actually starts about not mites exactly, but about lice and the hair. So it's funny. Again, it's one of those novels that once you finish it, you go back to the front and you can kind of just see where all these connections, these little crumbs are being laid so that they can be illuminated later on. All right, and that leads us to this end scene, which I think is just exquisite. It's flawless. It's again orchestrated to perfection. Not a note, not a beat missed. It just culminated into this perfect kind of end point moment. And what am I talking about? What have I missed about this book that I have not told you yet about? It's this paramount question, this predominant question that exists, and it gets mentioned a few times throughout the novel and gets pressed and exemplified in the end. And that is, in a burning building, do you save the masterpiece or do you save the child? Do you save the Da Vinci painting or do you save the child? Do you save the beautiful piece of artwork or music or literature, or do you save the innocent little child? Even if it's baby Hitler, they discuss. And the narrator constantly puts forth and proclaims he would save the child. And he gets the chance to actually live up to that claim and that belief in his conviction at the end. So we're back at this morgue, which is again this absurdist place where the Picketists have rioted before and protested before. They got to this point where there's this giant statue that stomped on their leader, squished him, killed him. And again, in a Kafkaesque way, it seemed like people just went along living their lives. No one said anything about it. There's nothing on the news. It's just some massive, mystical, demonic statue just crushes somebody, and they just keep going on. But they're back at this morgue, and again, I almost imagine it like, not quite like Moses, but you have the narrator almost in front of the people. All these Picketists, this massive crowd of people, including a lot of the characters earlier in the novel, have suddenly shown up, and they're all behind this leading individual, this leader of the people. And it is the narrator. He has this prophetic-like feeling to him, professing, listen to this message. We have an escape plan. We can get out of this. And who is he going against? Well, he's going against this massive black statue that represents eternal damnation, this queen of death, this queen of damnation that's representing sadness, despair, fear, nostalgia, bitterness, melancholy, nausea, fear, all of this stuff. And he's there with his girlfriend, Irina, and their child, who's about like a year at this time, this daughter. And again, the idea that it's a daughter, this infinite regeneration and rebirth, woman from woman from woman, ad infinitum is kind of going on there. But he has this chance where he's facing this giant statue. The poem from Dylan Thomas gets repeated again. I'll just read the last two lines of it. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. There's very much this Camus-like rebellion and rage against the absurd, raging against death, raging against it. The Picketists, again, how goofy is it to protest against death and disease like it's some kind of force that you can change the opinion of the outcome? Yet the Picketists are doing that. It's this resilience. It's this hope, help, right? And he gets to this last scene where the queen, the statue, brings up this fire pit. And, quote, at the same moment, we held them both over the fire, the girl and the manuscript. He gets this opportunity to choose. Masterpiece? Do you want to throw, and that's what he's throwing in. He's throwing in this book. This collection, in his terms, it's this collection of notebooks of writing of his whole life. Is he going to cast that into the flames? Cast a masterpiece? Cast this other figure, this other alternative version of himself that's some famous writer? Is he going to cast that into the fire, or is he going to cast his own daughter? Is he going to cast the innocent child who represents innocence and hope and humanity, kind of? And he saves the child. Saves his daughter, saves the child, and we kind of get it tied back to these solenoids. All the solenoids are now active. The one under the morgue is active. They're all on. And the whole city of Bucharest, this whole misery of mankind, this despair, the city full of despair and death and sickness. It's risen up. It's been stripped out of the earth, and beneath it you can see the demonic parasites and internal hell that's been going on within the city, within the school, within the people, all of that. And so that's kind of where the Solenoids tie in as well. And I don't know if it's a happy ending. He kind of just says, we went on to another town with my girl and my daughter, and kind of lived happily ever after there. In a way, he didn't escape, but he stamped his denial, stamped his rejection, I would say better, more than denial. He stamped his rejection, his rebellion, his refusal to accept and to bend the knee to death and to eternal damnation. So that's basically what this ending was, and I imagine it very much how I pictured it. The imagery was magnificent. How I viewed it was the last judgment, the day of judgment, the day of reckoning, however you want to view it. Revelations in the Bible, this day where hell has come upon earth, and there's this moment to see what you're made of, to show your true colors, your true face. And that's really what came to mind and what I felt like was being alluded to in that last scene. So that is a long explanation and investigation discussion around Solenoid. I loved it. I loved the overlapping components. I mean, I'm very drawn in and fascinated with entertaining the idea of alternate realities and dreams and existential dread and themes like that. I mean, I have plenty of videos on that, a recent video on existentialism. You guys all know I'm very interested in that idea, and I think it was explored in a very fun and nuanced way. It drew in a lot of people and writers that I enjoy, whether it is Kafka or some of these other authors and books he references within the poems he quotes. It's just magnificent novel, a must read, riveting and enthralling throughout. I'll give it a few critiques, and I'll anticipate one as well. There were sections that were a little bit exhaustive. There were sentences and paragraphs that seemed to just be a little bit word vomit, which might be the influence of Pynchon a little bit. It might be partly translation. There were sections that could have maybe been condensed. There were sections that maybe could have gotten rid of. But for the most part, it was tied together quite nicely. And actually, Cartarescu meant for it to be like this. He was speaking about his earlier book, Blinding, but I think it translated in this book as well, where he has all these diverging routes, and slowly, click, 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 he's trying to have it culminate to some massive, apotheosis, some key climactic point or experience that happens at the end of the novel, where you have this aha and everything just feels like it was tied together nicely.
I had to become more focused on what I did. So my liberty was smaller and smaller to the end of the book because I had to end each and every of those 40 stories. So I had to make them click. And I heard, while writing them, I heard click, 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 click 40 times, and a big click above, just like sigillating a bag, a plastic bag, and then a huge click above the last click.
So there were some sections that maybe could have been condensed or done without. And then another criticism I can foresee is for those people that are very hypercritical of dude bro lit, so novels that often either don't depict women in a great way, or they're misogynistic, or they're very they objectify women in a very blatant way. This book has plenty of female characters, and not all of them are overly sexualized or objectified, but there is plenty of that. So I can foresee there being fair criticism of, hey, a lot of times when these female characters are showing up in this novel, they're purely used for sexual gratification of the main character or in some kind of objectified way. They don't have there's no strong female character, I guess, throughout this novel. But to be fair, the male characters are full of flaws as well, and even the principal, Borescu, I think is what his name is. I'd have to look it up again. He was just, a scumbag of a man, a Harvey Weinstein type, where he's trying to sleep with the teachers, and and that's called out. So I don't think it's at all in the slightest a misogynistic novel, but I think part of maybe the writer coming from Romanian culture and the translation and maybe what the work is digging into, the female characters didn't come across as too independent. Sometimes they were, again, objectified in a way. So I just foresee that criticism. So that is my review of Solenoid. Again, I might be missing some things, and if I am, please leave it in the comments below. I didn't want to watch other reviews. I wanted to come here as fresh and natural and authentic as possible, share my thoughts, but I'm sure I'm missing some connections. I'm sure there's certain quotes or certain topics and ideas that you could go further on. This book is one that's worth revisiting over and over again, but to end on a good note and on a note that might entice you to buy the book, which I'll link in the description, is this quote right here on page 209. Quote, "The world is full of the millions of novels that elie the only sense that writing ever had. To understand yourself to the very end, up to the only chamber in the mind's labyrinth you are not permitted to enter. The only texts that should ever be read are the unartistic and unliterary ones, bitter and incomprehensible books that their authors were crazy to write, but which flowed from their dementia, sadness, and despair like springs of holy water." So, that is it. Solenoid, Mircea Cartarescu. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave comments down below if you have any questions or thoughts on the matter. Like the video, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.